I never imagined I'd live long enough to feel invisible in my own family. But when I found out my tax return had been secretly redirected to my son's New York apartment, without my knowledge, that's exactly how I felt, erased. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 73, I thought I understood the rhythm of my life. Every morning, I wake in my small Brooklyn apartment to the whir of city buses outside, their hydraulic brakes hissing like whispered secrets. The smell of stale coffee lingers in the air from the diner downstairs, mixing with the faint scent of my lavender soap. My days had become a careful choreography of silent chores and patient waiting, waiting for a call that almost never came, waiting for a text that remained unread, waiting for some sign that I still mattered in the lives I'd spent decades nurturing. The apartment itself tells the story of my shrinking world. Faded photographs crowd the mantelpiece above a radiator that clanks like an old friend trying to say hello. The walls, once filled with children's artwork and family portraits, now feel too large for just me. I'd grown used to the echo of my own footsteps on the hardwood floors, the way my voice sounded hollow when I talked to myself while making tea. The kitchen table, once surrounded by 4 chairs for family dinners, now holds only my medications lined up like tiny soldiers, each one a reminder of the years that have passed. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed. The mailbox downstairs had been empty again, another day without even a piece of junk mail to break the monotony. But when I called the IRS about my delayed tax refund, the woman on the other end of the line delivered words that made my heart stop. "Ma'am, your refund was mailed 3 weeks ago to your address on East 86th Street in Manhattan." I don't live on East 86th Street. I've never lived on East 86th Street. But my son Michael does. I stood there in my tiny kitchen, the phone trembling in my arthritis-worn hands, staring at the cracked linoleum beneath my slippers. The city noise outside, car horns, sirens, the constant hum of 8 million people living their lives, suddenly felt deafening. How do you explain to a stranger that your own child has stolen your identity? How do you say out loud that the boy you raised, the man you sacrificed everything for, has been intercepting your mail like you're nothing more than a mark in some con game? The silence that followed the phone call was different from my usual solitude. This wasn't just being alone, this was being erased. I sat down at my kitchen table, pushing aside the pill organizer and the stack of unpaid bills, and tried to make sense of what I'd just learned. My hands shook as I reached for the drawer where I kept my important papers, documents I hadn't looked at in months because I trusted that things were being handled properly. That's when I found the first piece of evidence. A bank statement I didn't remember receiving, showing withdrawals I didn't remember making. My reading glasses, the cheap ones from the drugstore, slipped down my nose as I squinted at the numbers. $200 here. $500 there. All authorized by my signature, except I hadn't signed anything. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the reality settled over me like a heavy winter coat. I walked to the window and looked out at the street below, watching people hurry past with their purpose and their destinations. An older woman walked slowly with her grocery cart, and I wondered if she, too, had adult children who saw her as nothing more than an ATM machine with a heartbeat. I thought about Michael's childhood. The boy with the gap-toothed grin who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. The teenager who borrowed my car and returned it with an empty gas tank and a sheepish smile. The young man who called me crying at 3 in the morning when his first girlfriend broke his heart. Where had that boy gone? When had he learned to see me not as his mother, but as a resource to be managed and exploited? The memories came flooding back, each one now tainted with new understanding. The times he'd offered to help with my finances. The way he'd insisted on being added to my bank account, just in case of emergencies. The gentle manipulation disguised as concern. "Mom, you can't handle all this paperwork at your age. Let me take care of it for you." I'd been so grateful for his attention, so pleased that he wanted to stay involved in my life, that I'd handed over control without a second thought. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my narrow bed, listening to the couple upstairs argue about money in Spanish, their voices mixing with the distant sound of the subway. Every creak of the building made me jump. Every shadow on the wall looked like a threat. For the first time in years, I felt truly afraid, not of being alone, but of what I might discover if I kept digging. You know that feeling when you realize you've been living a lie? When everything you thought you understood about your life suddenly shifts, like looking at a familiar painting and realizing it's been hanging upside down all along. That's what the next few days were like for me. I started going through years of statements, receipts, documents I'd signed without reading carefully. The evidence was everywhere, hidden in plain sight like a magician's trick I'd been too trusting to see. Michael had been systematic about it. Small amounts at first, $50 here, $100 there. Nothing big enough to set off alarms, nothing that would make me question his motives. But over the course of 3 years, those small amounts had added up to nearly $15,000. My entire savings account, the money I'd set aside from my late husband Robert's Social Security benefits was gone. The nest egg I'd planned to use for emergencies, for maybe a few small trips in my remaining years, had been siphoned away by the person I trusted most. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the realization that every conversation we'd had during those 3 years had been built on deception. Every time he'd called to check on me, every time he'd visited for Sunday dinner, every "I love you, Mom" had been seasoned with lies. He'd sat at my table, eating my homemade lasagna, asking about my health and my day, all while stealing from me behind my back. I remember the last time he'd visited, just 2 weeks earlier. He'd seemed nervous, fidgeting with his phone and avoiding eye contact. At the time, I'd attributed it to stress from his job. Now I realized he was probably calculating how much more he could take before I noticed. The thought made my stomach turn. But let me tell you about the years that led to this betrayal, because understanding how I got here is important to understanding why it hurt so much. I want you to see the foundation of sacrifice that Michael built his deception on, the history of love and giving that made his actions not just criminal, but personally devastating. I became a widow at 58. Robert had been my anchor for 35 years, the steady presence that made raising 3 children feel possible. When the heart attack took him, sudden, violent, with no warning, I thought my world had ended. But I had responsibilities. Linda was finishing college, Michael was struggling to find his footing after dropping out of school, and my youngest, Sarah, was only 16 and angry at the world for taking her father away. Robert had been the disciplinarian, the one who set boundaries and enforced consequences. Without him, I became both mother and father, both the nurturer and the authority figure. It was a role I was never quite comfortable with, but I did my best. I took on extra shifts at the hospital where I worked as a nurse's aide, my feet swelling in orthopedic shoes as I walked miles of corridor each day, caring for other people's elderly parents while worrying about how to care for my own children. Michael struggled the most with Robert's death. He'd been Daddy's boy, the son who'd planned to take over Robert's small plumbing business. Without his father's guidance, he seemed lost, drifting from job to job, relationship to relationship, always looking for something he couldn't name. I became his safety net, the place he landed when everything else fell apart. "Mom, I just need a little help getting back on my feet," he'd say, standing in my kitchen with his hands in his pockets and that lost boy expression that never failed to melt my heart. How could I say no? How could I watch my child struggle when I had the means to help? So I helped. And helped. And helped. I paid his rent when he was between jobs. I bought his groceries when his unemployment ran out. I gave him money for gas, for clothes, for the security deposit on his apartment in Manhattan. I told myself it was temporary, that he just needed time to figure things out. But temporary stretched into months, then years. My savings account, which had been healthy when Robert died, began to shrink as steadily as my expectations. Linda noticed first. She'd always been the practical one, the daughter who balanced her checkbook to the penny and never bought anything she couldn't afford. She watched me write another check to Michael and shook her head in disapproval. "Mom, you're enabling him," she said during one of our Tuesday phone calls. "He's never going to grow up if you keep rescuing him." "He's struggling," I defended. "He just needs a little support until he finds his direction." "It's been 5 years, Mom. How much direction does one person need?" But I couldn't stop. Something inside me, some deep maternal instinct, insisted that if I just loved him enough, supported him enough, believed in him enough, he'd eventually become the man I knew he could be. I ignored the fact that my help seemed to make him more dependent, not less. I overlooked his sense of entitlement, the way he'd grown comfortable with my financial support. I made excuses for his anger when I occasionally said no to his requests. The truth is, I was afraid of losing him entirely. Robert's death had taught me how quickly the people you love can disappear from your life. If giving Michael money was the price of keeping him in mine, it seemed like a bargain. I didn't realize I was actually paying for the privilege of being used. Sarah, my youngest, handled her father's death differently. She threw herself into school, earned a scholarship to a college in California, and carved out a life as far from Brooklyn as she could get. She called on holidays and sent birthday cards, but I could feel the distance growing between us with each passing year. She'd found her way to heal and move forward. I was still stuck, still trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed. Linda lived her own life, married with 2 children, busy with the chaos of raising a young family while working full-time. She loved me, I knew, but she had her own struggles and couldn't understand why I continued to subsidize Michael's irresponsibility. Our conversations often ended in tension, with her frustrated by my choices and me feeling judged and misunderstood. So Michael became the child who needed me most, and I confused being needed with being loved. I convinced myself that the phone calls asking for money were really phone calls asking for connection. I told myself that his visits to my apartment were motivated by affection, not just by the knowledge that I was good for a loan or a free meal. The day I discovered he'd been forging my signature on checks, I should have confronted him immediately. Instead, I made excuses. Maybe he'd made a mistake. Maybe there was some explanation I wasn't seeing. Maybe I was remembering wrong, and I had authorized those withdrawals after all. The power of denial is incredible when the alternative is facing a truth that might shatter you completely. But sitting in my kitchen that March morning, staring at evidence I could no longer deny, I had to confront the reality that my son had been stealing from me systematically and deliberately. This wasn't desperation or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was calculated deception, carried out over years, while he looked me in the eye and told me he loved me. The phone rang while I was going through the papers. For a moment, I thought it might be Michael, calling with some cosmic sense that I'd discovered his secret. But it was Mrs. Chen from down the hall, her gentle voice asking if I needed anything from the grocery store. Eleanor Chen had moved into the building 2 years ago, a widow herself, and we'd developed a quiet friendship built on shared solitude and occasional cups of tea. "I'm fine, thank you," I told her, though I wasn't fine at all. I was drowning in betrayal and didn't know how to ask for help without admitting how foolish I'd been. "You sound upset, dear. Would you like some company?" Something in her voice, a quality of genuine concern without judgment, made my carefully constructed composure crumble. "Could you come over for a few minutes?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Eleanor Chen knocked softly on my door 10 minutes later, carrying a thermos of jasmine tea and wearing the kind, weathered expression that comes from having lived through her own share of difficult times. She listened without interruption as I showed her the evidence of what Michael had been doing. Her lips pressed together in a thin line of indignation on my behalf, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel completely alone. "What are you going to do?" she asked when I finished explaining. "I don't know," I admitted. Part of me wants to pretend I never found out. Part of me wants to scream at him until my voice gives out. And part of me wants to just disappear so I don't have to deal with any of this. "What do you want to happen?" she asked, pouring more tea into my cup. It was such a simple question, but no one had asked me what I wanted in so long that I almost didn't know how to answer. What did I want? I wanted my son back. I wanted the boy who used to hug me so tight I could barely breathe, who used to tell me I was the best mom in the world, who used to care about my feelings more than my bank account. But that boy was gone, maybe had been gone for years, and I'd been too afraid to notice. "I want him to stop," I said finally. "I want him to see me as his mother, not as his personal ATM. I want him to care about me enough to tell me the truth, even if the truth is that he's in trouble and needs help. I want to matter to him for reasons that have nothing to do with money. And if he can't give you that?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke. If he couldn't give me that, then what? Was I prepared to lose my son in order to save myself? Was I strong enough to choose my own dignity over his presence in my life, regardless of the price of keeping him there? That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I opened a new bank account at a different branch, one where Michael had no access and no knowledge. I transferred what little money remained in my old account and began the process of reclaiming control over my own finances. It felt both empowering and terrifying, like learning to walk again after months in bed. I also did something I'd never done before. I called Linda and told her everything. My practical daughter listened with the focused attention she brought to solving problems, asking clarifying questions and taking notes. When I finished, there was a long silence. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she said finally, and I could hear tears in her voice. I knew something wasn't right, but I never imagined it was this bad. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I was ashamed, I admitted. I felt so stupid for letting it happen. I kept thinking I could handle it on my own, or that maybe I was wrong about what I was seeing. "You're not stupid. You're trusting," and he took advantage of that trust. There's a difference. Is there? Because right now, I feel like the biggest fool in Brooklyn. Mom, listen to me. What Michael did was wrong, and it's not your fault. Being a loving mother doesn't make you stupid. Being generous doesn't make you a fool. The person who should be ashamed is him, not you. Her words were like cool water on a burn. For days, I'd been carrying the weight of self-blame along with the pain of betrayal. Hearing my sensible daughter confirm that I was the victim, not the villain, in this story helped me begin to separate guilt from grief. But knowing I was a victim and knowing what to do about it were two different things entirely. How do you confront someone you love with evidence of their betrayal? How do you have a conversation about theft and deception with the child you raised to know right from wrong? How do you prepare for the possibility that they might deny everything, or worse, that they might not even be sorry? I spent the next week rehearsing different approaches. Sometimes I imagined myself calm and reasonable, laying out the evidence like a prosecutor making a case. Other times I pictured myself screaming and crying, unleashing years of accumulated frustration and hurt. But when Michael called on Sunday, asking if he could come over for dinner, I didn't feel calm or angry. I felt scared. He arrived with a small bouquet of deli flowers and his usual charm, commenting on how good the apartment smelled and asking about my health with apparent genuine interest. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything, that there was some innocent explanation for what I'd discovered. But then I noticed his eyes scanning the room, taking inventory, and I remembered that this was just another performance. We ate my pot roast in relative silence, making small talk about the weather and his job at the electronics store. He seemed nervous, checking his phone frequently and avoiding sustained eye contact. Halfway through the meal, he brought up money. "Mom, I'm in a tight spot this month," he said, using the same opening line he'd used dozens of times before. "My rent went up, and I haven't gotten my commission check yet. Could you help me out with maybe $800? Just until next week." This was it. The moment I'd been dreading and preparing for. I set down my fork and looked at him across the table, this man who looked like my son but felt like a stranger. "Michael," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "I know about the tax return." The change in his expression was immediate and complete. The color drained from his face, and his eyes went wide with the look of someone who'd just realized their carefully constructed world was about to collapse. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I know about the bank withdrawals," I continued. "I know about the forged signatures. I know about all of it. Mom, I can explain, can you?" I asked. "Can you explain why my tax refund was sent to your address? Can you explain why my signature appears on checks I never signed? Can you explain why thousands of dollars have disappeared from my account over the past 3 years?" He tried several different approaches. First, denial. He didn't know what I was talking about, there must be some mistake, I was confused about the details. When that didn't work, he tried justification. He'd only taken what he needed, he'd planned to pay it back, he'd been protecting me from having to worry about managing so much money. Finally, he resorted to manipulation. I was being cruel and suspicious, he needed my help more than ever. How could I accuse my own son of stealing from me? But something had changed in me during those days of discovery and reflection. His familiar tactics didn't land the way they used to. I found myself listening to his words as if they were coming from a stranger, analyzing them for truth instead of automatically accepting them as reality. And what I found was a pattern of deception so practiced and polished that it was almost impressive in its thoroughness. "Are you sorry?" I asked when he finished his latest attempt at explanation. He paused, and I could see him calculating which answer would serve him best. "Of course I'm sorry, Mom. I never meant for you to find out like this. I was going to tell you when the time was right." "You're sorry I found out," I said. "But are you sorry you did it?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I was trying to help. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The city is expensive, and I'm barely keeping my head above water. I knew you'd want to help if you could. So you helped yourself without asking. I was going to pay it back." "When?" "It's been 3 years, Michael." "When exactly were you planning to pay back $15,000 on your electronics store salary?" The number hung between us like a physical thing. $15,000. More money than I'd been able to save in the 5 years since Robert died. Money that represented security, independence, the difference between being comfortable and being desperate. Money he'd taken as casually as if it were pocket change. "I didn't realize it was that much," he said weakly. "You didn't realize, or you didn't care? That's not fair. What's not fair is stealing from your elderly mother. What's not fair is lying to me for 3 years while I worried about you and supported you and believed in you. What's not fair is making me feel like a fool for trusting my own son." He tried to leave then, muttering something about how he couldn't deal with this kind of attack and how ungrateful I was being after everything he'd done for me. But I stood between him and the door, a 73-year-old woman in house slippers blocking the exit like a security guard. "We're not finished," I said. "Mom, you're being unreasonable." I said I was sorry. "What more do you want?" "I want you to understand what you've done to me. I want you to acknowledge that this was wrong, not just unfortunate or misunderstood, but wrong. And I want you to tell me why you thought it was acceptable to steal from someone who's never said no to you when you asked for help honestly." "I wasn't stealing. It's not like you were going to miss it." "How do you know what I was going to miss? How do you know what plans I had for that money, what emergencies I was saving for, what small dreams I was hoping to fulfill? You took away my choices and my security without even asking what they meant to me. You don't need that much money. You live in this tiny apartment, you don't go anywhere, you don't do anything. What were you saving it for?" The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. In his mind, I wasn't a whole person with desires and plans and fears. I was just an old woman warehoused in a small apartment, existing without purpose or dreams worth considering. My money was wasted on me because my life was wasted on me. "Get out," I said quietly. "Mom, get out of my apartment. Get out now." "You don't mean that." "I've never meant anything more in my life. Get out, and don't come back until you're ready to have an honest conversation about what you've done and what's going to happen next." He left, but not before trying one more manipulation. "You're going to regret this," he said at the door. "I'm the only one who cares about you. Linda's too busy with her own life, and Sarah might as well live on another planet. If you push me away, you'll have nobody. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table and cried harder than I had since Robert's funeral. But these weren't just tears of grief, they were tears of recognition. I was mourning the loss of the son I thought I had, but I was also acknowledging the relief of finally seeing the truth clearly. The relationship I'd been fighting so hard to preserve hadn't been real for years. I'd been nurturing a ghost while the person my son had actually become systematically stole from me. The next few days brought a parade of phone calls and text messages. Michael tried every approach in his emotional manipulation playbook. He was angry. How could I treat him like a criminal when he was family? He was hurt. He'd never expected such cruelty from his own mother. He was repentant. He'd made mistakes, but he loved me and wanted to make things right. He was threatening. If I didn't drop this foolishness, I might lose him forever. But the strangest thing was happening to me during this barrage of communication. Instead of feeling guilty or scared or desperate to smooth things over, I felt calm. Each message confirmed what I'd begun to understand. This wasn't about money, and it never had been. This was about power and control and a fundamental lack of respect for me as a person. Michael wasn't upset because he'd hurt me. He was upset because I'd discovered his deception and disrupted a system that had been working very well for him. Linda called me every day during this period, checking in and offering support. She was furious with her brother, but she was also worried about me. "Are you sure you're okay, Mom? You sound different." "Different how?" "Stronger, I guess. More definite. Like you've made up your mind about something important." She was right. I had made up my mind. For the first time in years, I was thinking about what I wanted rather than what everyone else needed from me. I was considering my own well-being instead of constantly managing other people's emotions. It was a foreign concept, but it was growing on me. Eleanor Chin continued to check on me, bringing soup and tea and the kind of undemanding companionship that felt like a gift. She didn't offer advice or try to fix anything, she just sat with me in the messiness of the situation and made it clear that I wasn't alone. Her presence reminded me that relationships didn't have to be transactional, that it was possible for people to care about each other without keeping score or expecting payment. 2 weeks after the confrontation with Michael, Linda asked if she could come over to talk. She arrived on a Saturday morning with bagels from the good deli down the street and a serious expression that reminded me of her father. "I've been thinking about what Michael did," she said as we sat at my kitchen table. "And I've been thinking about some things that happened over the years that maybe I should have paid more attention to." "What kinds of things?" "Remember when Dad died, and we were going through his papers? Michael offered to help you organize everything, and we all thought it was sweet that he wanted to take care of you." I nodded. "He was very helpful during that time. But looking back, I think that's when it started. He learned about your finances during that process, how much money you had, where it was kept, how you managed your accounts. He saw an opportunity and started planning even then." The suggestion made my stomach turn, but it also made terrible sense. Michael's helpfulness after Robert's death, his eagerness to take care of Mom, his gentle insistence that I needed protection from the complexities of managing money alone, it had all felt like love and concern at the time. But viewed through the lens of what I now knew, it looked more like a long con begun while I was still raw with grief. "There's something else," Linda continued. "When I was going through my own finances last week, I found some irregularities. Small amounts, nothing as systematic as what he did to you, but enough to make me wonder if he's been taking advantage of more than one family member." "What kind of irregularities?" "A few $100s here and there from a joint account Tom and I set up for the kids' college fund. Michael had access to it because we wanted him to be able to contribute when he could, but instead of contributing, it looks like he's been withdrawing small amounts over the past year." The picture that emerged from our conversation was of someone who'd made a career out of financial manipulation, starting with the person who was most likely to trust him and expanding from there. Linda's discovery suggested that I wasn't just the victim of my son's desperation, I was the primary target in a pattern of behavior that had probably cost our family tens of thousands of dollars over the years. "What are we going to do?" Linda asked. "What do you mean, we?" I replied. "This is my decision to make. Mom, he's stolen from both of us. This affects the whole family. And I'll handle it the way I think is best. You can make your own decisions about your own situation, but don't expect me to coordinate my response with yours or anyone else's." Linda looked surprised by my answer, and I realized I'd surprised myself too. The old Eleanor would have immediately started worrying about family harmony, about keeping everyone happy, about finding a solution that upset the fewest people. But the new Eleanor, the one who'd been emerging over the past few weeks, was more interested in what was right than what was comfortable. "I'm going to report him," I said, the words coming out before I'd even realized I'd made the decision. "Report him where?" "To the police. To the bank. To anyone who will listen. What he did was theft, Linda. It doesn't stop being theft just because we're related." "Mom, are you sure? Once you involve the authorities, there's no taking it back." Michael could end up in jail. Then Michael should have thought about that before he started forging my signature on checks. Linda left that day looking troubled, but I felt more at peace than I had in weeks. The decision to report Michael's actions wasn't driven by anger or revenge, it was driven by a recognition that some lines couldn't be uncrossed, some betrayals couldn't be forgiven without consequences, and some relationships couldn't be preserved without destroying yourself in the process. Monday morning, I walked into the police station in my neighborhood and filed a report. The officer who took my statement was kind but matter-of-fact, explaining the process and the likely outcomes. Economic crimes against elderly family members were unfortunately common, he told me, and the legal system had procedures for handling them. I would need to gather documentation, work with the district attorney's office, and prepare for the possibility that Michael might face criminal charges. It felt surreal, sitting in that fluorescent-lit office, describing my son's actions to a uniformed stranger who took notes without apparent emotion. This was my child I was talking about, the boy who'd played at my feet while I cooked dinner, who'd cried in my arms when his goldfish died, who'd walked me down the aisle at Linda's wedding when Tom's father couldn't attend. How had we gotten from there to here? But even as I felt the weight of what I was doing, I also felt the lightness of finally telling the truth to someone whose job it was to take that truth seriously. The police officer didn't question whether I was being too harsh or ask whether I'd tried to work things out as a family. He simply documented what had happened and explained what would happen next. There was something liberating about dealing with someone who approached the situation based on facts rather than feelings. The bank was my next stop. I met with a fraud investigator who reviewed the evidence I'd collected and confirmed that what Michael had done constituted identity theft and check fraud. They froze the account he'd been accessing, reversed some of the unauthorized charges, and helped me set up new security measures for my financial accounts. The process was lengthy and sometimes frustrating, but every step made me feel more like I was reclaiming control over my own life. Michael called while I was at the bank. My phone rang in the middle of my meeting with the fraud investigator, and I saw his name on the screen. For a moment, I considered answering, but then I realized I had nothing new to say to him until he was ready to have a different kind of conversation than the ones we'd been having. I let it go to voicemail. The message he left was different from his previous communications. Gone was the anger and the manipulation. Instead, he sounded scared and smaller, like the boy he used to be when he knew he was in real trouble. "Mom, I heard you went to the police. Please don't do this. I know I messed up, but we can work this out as a family. I'll pay you back, I promise. I'll get a second job, I'll do whatever you want, just please don't destroy my life over this. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm really, truly sorry. Please call me back." I listened to the message 3 times, hearing echoes of every apology he'd ever given me for smaller transgressions throughout his childhood. But this wasn't childhood anymore, and the consequences weren't something I could soften with maternal forgiveness and a stern talking to. This was adult behavior with adult consequences, and trying to protect him from those consequences would only teach him that his actions didn't really matter as long as he could manipulate the right people. Eleanor Chen was waiting in my apartment when I got home from the bank, having let herself in with the spare key I'd given her weeks earlier. She'd made tea and set out some of the butter cookies she knew I liked. The apartment smelled like jasmine and comfort, and I felt some of the tension from the day begin to dissolve. "How did it go?" she asked as I settled into my chair at the kitchen table. "Hard," I admitted. "But necessary. Do you want to talk about it?" I found myself describing the entire day, the police station, the bank, Michael's voicemail, the strange mixture of grief and relief that seemed to accompany every step of this process. Eleanor listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that helped me clarify my own thoughts and feelings. "Are you second-guessing yourself?" she asked when I finished. "Constantly. But not because I think I'm wrong, because I've spent so many years putting everyone else's comfort ahead of my own well-being that choosing myself feels almost selfish. Protecting yourself from theft isn't selfish. Expecting honesty from your family isn't selfish. Creating consequences for bad behavior isn't selfish. I know that intellectually. But emotionally, it still feels like I'm being the mean, unforgiving mother who cares more about money than family relationships. What would you tell a friend who was in your situation?" The question stopped me short. If Eleanor had come to me with this story, if she'd told me her son had been stealing from her for years and she was struggling with whether to report him, what would my advice be? I knew immediately and without hesitation, I would tell her she had every right to protect herself, that what had happened to her was wrong, and that she deserved better from someone who claimed to love her. "I'd tell her she was being brave," I said slowly. "I'd tell her she was doing the right thing. And you'd be right. So why is it different when it's you?" "Because he's my son. Because I'm supposed to love him unconditionally. Because families are supposed to work things out on their own. Unconditional love doesn't mean accepting unconditional abuse. And families who steal from each other aren't working very well, are they?" That night, I had the first peaceful sleep I'd experienced in weeks. Something about taking concrete action, about moving from victim to advocate for myself, had quieted the anxious voice in my head that had been running constantly since I'd first discovered Michael's deception. I wasn't just enduring the situation anymore, I was addressing it. Over the next few days, I began to notice other changes in myself. I stood straighter when I walked down the street. I made eye contact with cashiers and neighbors instead of looking down at my hands. I stopped apologizing for taking up space in conversations or for having opinions that might conflict with other people's preferences. It was as if standing up to Michael had given me permission to stand up for myself in general. Linda called to check on me and seemed surprised by the tone of my voice. "Mom, you sound different." "Good different, but different." "How so?" "More confident, I guess. Less worried about what everyone else thinks. Maybe it's because I finally stopped trying to manage everyone else's feelings and started paying attention to my own." "How are you feeling about everything with Michael?" "Sad that it came to this. Sorry that he chose this path. But not sorry that I'm finally protecting myself." "Have you heard from him?" "He calls and leaves messages, but I'm not ready to talk to him yet. When I am ready, if I'm ever ready, we'll have that conversation. But it's going to be on my terms, not his." Linda was quiet for a moment. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I know this isn't easy, but you're handling it with more grace than I think I would in your situation." Her words meant more to me than she probably realized. Linda had always been the strong one, the one who made difficult decisions without agonizing over them endlessly. Hearing her express respect for how I was managing this crisis felt like recognition that I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. But the real test of my new resolve came 3 weeks later, when Michael showed up at my apartment unannounced. I heard his key in the lock, a key I'd forgotten he had until that moment, and then his voice calling Mom as he let himself in. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner, when he appeared in the doorway. He looked terrible, thinner than usual, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worry. For a moment, my maternal instincts kicked in, and I wanted to ask if he'd been eating enough, if he was taking care of himself, if there was anything I could do to help. But then I remembered why he was there, and what he'd done, and the fact that he'd just let himself into my apartment without permission after weeks of me refusing his calls. The old Eleanor might have focused on his obvious distress and ignored the boundary violation. The new Eleanor saw it as just another example of his belief that my wishes and comfort were secondary to his needs. "How did you get in here?" I asked, not moving from my position at the sink. "I still have my key." "You shouldn't have used it without permission." "Mom, we need to talk. We need to do a lot of things, Michael. But first, you need to give me that key and ask if you can stay, not just assume you're welcome." He looked surprised by my directness, but he pulled the key from his pocket and set it on the counter between us. "May I please stay and talk to you?" "For a few minutes. But I'm not changing my mind about the police report, if that's what you're hoping for." "The detective called me," he said, settling into the chair across from me without being invited to sit. "They want me to come in for questioning next week. I'm sorry to hear that this is stressful for you. But actions have consequences, Michael. You knew that when you decided to start forging my signature." "Mom, please. I made a mistake, but don't ruin my whole life over it. You made a series of deliberate choices over the course of several years. And I'm not ruining your life, you did that when you decided to steal from me." We stared at each other across my small kitchen table, and I realized this was the first completely honest conversation we'd had in years. No pretense, no manipulation, no careful avoidance of difficult topics. Just the truth, stark and uncomfortable, sitting between us like a third person at the table. "What do you want me to say?" he asked finally. "I want you to tell me the truth about why you did it. Not your justifications or your excuses, but the real reason you thought it was acceptable to steal from me." He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands while I waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I could. Because you never said no to me when I asked for money, and because I knew you wouldn't check the accounts carefully enough to notice what I was doing. Because I was desperate and stupid and I knew you loved me enough to forgive me even if you found out." "And how does it feel now, knowing that your desperation and stupidity and assumption of forgiveness have brought us to this point?" "Horrible. I feel horrible about all of it. But Mom, I can't undo it. I can only try to make it right going forward." "How?" "I'll pay you back. I'll get help for my financial problems. I'll do whatever you want. What I want is for you to understand that this isn't just about money, Michael. This is about trust and respect and the fundamental nature of our relationship. You saw me as someone to be managed and manipulated, not as a person whose feelings and security mattered. That's not something you can fix by writing a check. Then what can I do?" "I don't know. That's something you're going to have to figure out for yourself. But it starts with taking full responsibility for what you did, without trying to minimize it or explain it away. And it continues with accepting the consequences of your actions, even if those consequences are more serious than you'd like them to be." He left shortly after that, looking defeated but not necessarily enlightened. I wasn't sure he truly understood the magnitude of what he'd done or the depth of the damage to our relationship. But for the first time, I wasn't taking responsibility for his emotional education. If he wanted to rebuild something with me, if such a thing was even possible, he was going to have to do the work of figuring out how. The next few months passed in a strange rhythm of legal proceedings and personal healing. Michael was formally charged with identity theft and check fraud. He hired a lawyer, who immediately began the process of negotiating a plea deal that would allow him to avoid jail time in exchange for restitution and community service. I participated in these proceedings when necessary, but I tried not to let them dominate my thoughts or energy. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life in ways that had nothing to do with Michael or his legal troubles. I started taking a watercolor painting class at the senior center, something I'd always wanted to try but had never made time for. I reconnected with some old friends from my nursing aid days, women I'd lost touch with during the years when I was so focused on managing my children's needs that I'd neglected my own relationships. Eleanor Chen and I developed a deeper friendship, sharing dinners once or twice a week and discovering that we had more in common than just widowhood and proximity. She'd been a teacher before her husband died, and she had a sharp wit and a perspective on life that I found both challenging and encouraging. She never asked about Michael's legal situation, but she was always ready to listen when I wanted to talk about how I was feeling about everything. Linda visited more frequently during this period, and our relationship shifted in subtle but important ways. She stopped treating me like someone who needed protection from difficult realities, and I stopped looking to her for validation of my choices. We began relating to each other more as equals, adult women who could offer each other support without either of us taking a parental role. Sarah called from California, having heard about the situation through Linda. I'd expected judgment or disappointment, but instead she expressed admiration for how I was handling things. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, Mom," she said during one of our longer conversations. "I know it can't be easy, but you deserve better than what Michael was giving you. I wish I'd figured that out sooner. You figured it out when you were ready to figure it out. That's what matters." The criminal case against Michael was resolved 6 months after I'd first filed the police report. He pled guilty to the charges and was sentenced to 2 years of probation, community service, and full restitution of the money he'd stolen from me. The judge also ordered him to attend financial counseling and stay away from me unless I specifically requested contact. I felt oddly detached from the sentencing hearing, watching my son stand before a judge and formally acknowledge his crimes. This wasn't the outcome I dreamed of when I was raising him, but it was the outcome his choices had made inevitable. I felt sorry for him, but I also felt relieved that there were finally official consequences for behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. The restitution payments began arriving monthly, small amounts that would take years to add up to what he'd stolen, but payments nonetheless. Each check felt like a small acknowledgement that what he'd done had been wrong, that my financial security mattered, that actions had consequences even within families. More importantly, the process of going through the legal system had given me something I hadn't expected: validation. Every official I'd dealt with, police officers, prosecutors, judges, had treated Michael's actions as serious crimes, not as family disagreements that should be resolved privately. Their response had confirmed what I'd struggled to believe: I had been wronged, I had the right to seek justice, and protecting myself wasn't an overreaction to a minor family dispute. 1 year after discovering the redirected tax return, I was a different person living a different life. I'd moved to a slightly larger apartment in a better neighborhood, using the restitution money and some careful financial planning to create more space and light in my daily environment. I decorated with bright colors and plants, making a home that reflected my personality rather than just serving as a place to exist quietly. My social circle had expanded beyond Eleanor Chen to include several women from my painting class and a book club I joined at the local library. I was learning that friendship in my 70s was different from friendship in my younger years, less complicated by competing responsibilities, more focused on genuine compatibility and shared interests. I'd also started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, helping other elderly people navigate the system when they'd been financially exploited by family members. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply satisfying, allowing me to use my experience to help others in similar situations. I discovered that I was good at listening without judgment and helping people find the courage to stand up for themselves. Michael and I had had no direct contact since the night he'd let himself into my apartment with his key. He'd sent a few letters through his lawyer during the legal proceedings, but I'd chosen not to respond to them. Linda occasionally mentioned that he was struggling financially and emotionally, and she always asked whether I might consider reaching out to him. "He's learned his lesson, Mom," she said during one of our Tuesday phone calls. "Maybe it's time to think about rebuilding your relationship." "Has he learned his lesson?" I asked. "Or has he just learned that there are consequences for getting caught?" I think you're being too hard on him. And I think you're not being hard enough. But that's your choice to make, just like this is mine. Don't you miss him? It was a fair question, and one I'd asked myself many times over the past year. Did I miss Michael? The answer was complicated. I missed the son I'd thought I had, the young man I'd believed loved and respected me. I missed the hope that we could have an honest, healthy relationship. I missed the family dinners and holiday celebrations that felt incomplete without him. But I didn't miss the anxiety that had accompanied every interaction with him for years. I didn't miss wondering whether he was being truthful or whether he was manipulating me. I didn't miss feeling like an ATM machine with a heartbeat. I didn't miss the gradual erosion of my self-respect that had come with allowing myself to be used. I miss who I thought he was, I told Linda. But I don't miss who he actually turned out to be. The second year after the discovery brought unexpected developments. Michael completed his community service requirement and began making more substantial restitution payments, suggesting that his financial situation had improved. Linda mentioned that he'd gotten a better job and seemed to be taking the financial counseling seriously. More significantly, he'd begun attending therapy to address what his counselor had identified as a pattern of manipulative behavior that extended beyond his financial crimes. According to Linda, he was starting to understand how his actions had affected not just my bank account, but my sense of safety and trust. He wants to write you a letter, Linda told me during one of our conversations. His therapist thinks it might be helpful for him to apologize in his own words, without lawyers or legal requirements involved. And what do you think? I think it couldn't hurt to read what he has to say. You don't have to respond, but maybe it would give you some insight into where his head is now. I thought about her suggestion for several days before deciding that I was curious enough to read whatever Michael wanted to say. I told Linda she could give him my permission to send one letter, with the understanding that I might not reply and that his sending it didn't guarantee any change in our relationship status. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, handwritten on plain paper in the careful cursive Michael had learned in elementary school. It was 3 pages long, and reading it was one of the most emotionally complex experiences I'd had since this whole situation began. He began by taking full responsibility for what he'd done, without excuses or justifications. He acknowledged that his actions hadn't been driven by desperate need, but by a sense of entitlement that had developed over years of being bailed out without consequences. He admitted that he'd seen me not as a person with my own needs and feelings, but as a resource that existed primarily to solve his problems. Most importantly, he acknowledged the depth of the betrayal he'd committed. I didn't just steal money from you, he wrote. I stole your peace of mind, your sense of security, and your ability to trust your own judgment. I made you doubt yourself and question your worth. I turned your love for me into a weapon against you, and that's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. The letter was powerful and seemed genuinely remorseful, but I found myself analyzing it the way I'd learned to analyze all of Michael's communications, looking for signs of manipulation, checking for sincerity versus performance. The fact that I couldn't fully trust even his apology was perhaps the clearest indication of how thoroughly he'd damaged our relationship. But something in the letter did reach me. His acknowledgement that he'd made me doubt myself resonated deeply because it named something I'd experienced but hadn't been able to articulate. For years, I'd questioned my own perceptions, wondered whether I was being too sensitive or too suspicious, blamed myself for not preventing what he'd done. His admission that he'd deliberately fostered that self-doubt felt like a crucial piece of truth. I decided to write back, not because I was ready to reconcile, but because I had things I needed to say that I'd never had the opportunity to express clearly. Dear Michael, I wrote, I received your letter and appreciate that you're beginning to understand the full impact of your actions. Your apology addresses many of the issues that have kept me from being able to consider rebuilding our relationship. However, I need you to understand that trust, once broken so thoroughly, cannot be rebuilt quickly or easily. The fact that you're in therapy and making restitution payments is encouraging, but it doesn't erase the years of deception or automatically restore what was lost. If you're serious about wanting a relationship with me in the future, you need to continue the work you're doing on yourself, not because you want something from me, but because it's the right thing to do. I need to see sustained change over a long period of time before I can consider letting you back into my life in any meaningful way. This doesn't mean I don't love you. It means I love myself enough not to accept treatment that diminishes my worth or security. I hope you can understand the difference. I sent the letter without agonizing over every word or second-guessing my decision. The woman who'd been afraid to confront her son about his theft 2 years earlier had been replaced by someone who could state her boundaries clearly and without apology. Michael's response came quickly and was mercifully brief. He thanked me for my honesty, acknowledged that rebuilding trust would take time, and committed to continuing his therapy and personal work regardless of what it meant for our relationship. He didn't ask for immediate forgiveness or push for a timeline for reconciliation. For the first time in years, he seemed to be putting my needs ahead of his own wants. Time moved differently in my new life. Days weren't measured by waiting for phone calls or managing other people's crises. Instead, they were filled with activities that brought me joy and relationships that felt reciprocal. My painting had improved to the point where I'd sold a few small pieces at a local art fair. My volunteer work at the legal aid clinic had evolved into a part-time paid position as a victim advocate. I was making new friends and strengthening old friendships. Eleanor Chen had become my closest companion, and our friendship had deepened into something that felt like family, but family based on choice and mutual affection rather than obligation and shared genetics. We traveled together, taking a bus tour through New England to see the fall foliage and planning a spring trip to Washington, D.C. to see the cherry blossoms. These weren't elaborate vacations, but they were adventures that reminded me I was still capable of experiencing wonder and joy. Most surprisingly, I'd begun dating. Harold was a widower I'd met at the book club, a retired high school history teacher who shared my love of reading and had a dry sense of humor that made me laugh in ways I'd almost forgotten were possible. Our relationship was progressing slowly and comfortably, built on genuine liking and respect rather than need or desperation. "You seem happy," Linda observed during one of her visits. "Different than you've been in years, but happy." "I feel different," I admitted. "I feel like I'm living my own life instead of just managing everyone else's." "Do you ever regret how things worked out with Michael?" "I regret that it came to this, but I don't regret protecting myself. I spent too many years putting everyone else's comfort ahead of my own well-being. He's doing better, you know. The therapy seems to be helping, and he's been consistent with the restitution payments." "I'm glad to hear that. But his recovery is his responsibility, not mine. Would you ever consider seeing him again? If he continues to do well. Maybe. Someday. If he demonstrates over a long period of time that he's genuinely changed, not just learned to be more careful about getting caught. But that's a decision for future me to make. Present me is focused on other things. And I was. For the first time in decades, I was focused on my own life, my own goals, my own happiness. It felt simultaneously selfish and necessary, indulgent and overdue. I was learning that self-care wasn't the same thing as selfishness, that having boundaries didn't make me mean, and that I deserved relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. 3 years after discovering that redirected tax return, I received an unexpected phone call from Michael. He'd been faithful about sending restitution payments and had written a few more letters over the years, but we hadn't spoken directly since the night he'd used his key to let himself into my apartment. "Mom," he said when I answered the phone, "I know we haven't talked in a long time, and I know you have every right to hang up on me. But I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to meet with me. Just for coffee or something brief. I have some things I'd like to say to you in person." I was quiet for a long moment, considering his request. The woman I'd been 3 years earlier would have immediately said yes, grateful for any contact with her estranged son. But the woman I'd become needed more information before making such a decision. "What kinds of things?" I asked. "An apology, mostly. A real one, not like the letters I've sent or the things I said during the legal proceedings. I understand now what I did to you in ways I didn't understand before, and I want to acknowledge that properly." "Michael, you've apologized in your letters. What would be different about an in-person apology?" "I want to look you in the eye when I say I'm sorry. I want you to be able to see that I mean it, and I want to answer any questions you might have about what happened or what I've been doing to change." "And what do you want from me in return?" "Nothing. I'm not asking for forgiveness or for you to trust me or for us to have a relationship again. I just want the chance to take responsibility for what I did in a more complete way than I've been able to do through letters." His answer surprised me with its apparent lack of agenda. In the past, Michael's requests had always carried hidden expectations or ulterior motives. This felt different, though I wasn't entirely convinced it was as straightforward as he was presenting it. "Let me think about it," I said. "I'll call you back in a few days with my answer." "That's fair. Thank you for considering it." After hanging up, I found myself genuinely uncertain about what I wanted to do. Part of me was curious to see Michael after all this time, to observe firsthand whether the changes he claimed to have made were visible in his demeanor and behavior. Another part of me was comfortable with our current lack of contact and saw no compelling reason to change that arrangement. I talked it over with Eleanor Chen during one of our dinner conversations. She listened thoughtfully as I described the phone call and my conflicted feelings about his request. "What's the worst thing that could happen if you meet with him?" she asked. "He could try to manipulate me again. He could make me feel guilty for maintaining my boundaries. He could convince me to let him back into my life before he's actually changed. And what's the best thing that could happen? I could see that he's genuinely different now. I could get some closure on this chapter of our relationship. I could feel confident that I made the right choice in how I handled everything. And what's most likely to happen? Probably something in between. He's probably changed some but not completely. I'll probably feel sadder about the whole situation but still convinced that maintaining my boundaries was correct. So the question is whether you think any of those outcomes would be worth the emotional energy of seeing him. Eleanor had a gift for helping me clarify my own thoughts without telling me what to do. Over the next several days, I realized that I was curious enough about Michael's current state of mind to make the emotional risk of seeing him worthwhile. I also realized that I was confident enough in my own boundaries to trust that I wouldn't let him manipulate me back into an unhealthy dynamic. I called him back and agreed to meet for coffee at a neutral location, a cafe in Midtown Manhattan that was convenient for both of us but held no emotional significance for either of us. We scheduled the meeting for the following Saturday afternoon, giving both of us a week to prepare emotionally. The night before our meeting, I sat in my apartment considering what I hoped to accomplish. I wasn't looking for reconciliation or for him to convince me that our relationship could be repaired. I was looking for closure, for a sense that this chapter of our lives had been properly concluded, whatever that might mean for future chapters. I arrived at the cafe early and chose a table near the window where I could watch the street while I waited. Michael appeared exactly on time, and I was struck immediately by how different he looked. He'd lost weight and seemed to carry himself differently, less cocky swagger, more quiet uncertainty. His clothes were nicer than I remembered, suggesting that his financial situation had indeed improved, but his overall demeanor was more subdued than the confident young man who'd been so sure he could charm his way out of any situation. "Thank you for coming," he said as he sat down across from me, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before, genuine humility. "You're welcome. I have to admit I was curious to see you. I probably look different. The last few years have been educational." We ordered coffee and sat in slightly uncomfortable silence for a few minutes while we each gathered our thoughts. Finally, Michael began the conversation I assumed he'd been planning for weeks. "Mom, I know I've apologized to you before, but I don't think I ever really understood what I was apologizing for until recently. I thought I was sorry for taking money from you, and I was. But what I've come to understand through therapy is that I stole much more than money." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I stole your sense of security. I stole your ability to trust your own perceptions. I stole your peace of mind and your confidence in your relationship with your own son. I turned your love for me into a vulnerability that I exploited systematically and deliberately." "Go on," I said, not yet ready to respond to what he was saying. "I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why I did it, not to excuse it but to make sure I never do anything like it again. What I've realized is that I had this sense of entitlement about your resources that went way beyond money. I felt entitled to your emotional energy, your financial support, your forgiveness, your attention, as if being your son gave me unlimited access to everything you had to give." "When did that entitlement develop?" "I think it started after Dad died. You were so focused on taking care of all of us that I learned I could get whatever I needed from you as long as I presented it as a need rather than a want. And over time, that dynamic became so normal that I stopped seeing you as a person with your own needs and feelings. You became just a resource to be managed." Hearing him articulate the dynamic so clearly was both validating and painful. He was describing exactly what I'd experienced but hadn't been able to name for years. The financial theft was just the most concrete expression of something that had been going on much longer, he continued. "I'd been stealing your emotional energy and your sense of self-worth for years before I started stealing money. And what's different now? I've been in therapy for almost 2 years, working specifically on understanding manipulative behavior and learning how to have healthy relationships. I've been attending support groups for people who financially exploited family members. I've been learning about the impact of what I did, not just on your bank account but on your mental and emotional health." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I wrote down some of the things I learned about the effects of financial exploitation on elderly victims, because I wanted to make sure I addressed all of them specifically." I was surprised by his thoroughness and the obvious effort he'd put into preparing for this conversation. The Michael I remembered had always been more impulsive, more likely to wing it through difficult discussions rather than planning them carefully. "You don't have to read me a list," I said. "Just tell me what you understand now that you didn't understand before." "I understand that what I did was a form of domestic violence. I understand that financial abuse often causes more long-term trauma than physical abuse because it attacks the victim's sense of competence and independence. I understand that you probably questioned your own judgment and intelligence for months or years after you discovered what I'd been doing." Everything he was saying was accurate, and hearing him acknowledge the psychological impact of his actions felt profoundly validating. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like he was seeing me as a complete person whose internal experience mattered. "I also understand," he continued, "that you may never trust me enough to have a relationship with me again, and that if that's the case, it's entirely my fault and entirely your right. What are you hoping will happen between us going forward?" "Honestly? I'm hoping that someday, maybe years from now, you'll be willing to give me the chance to show you that I've changed in a sustained way. Not next month or next year, but when you feel ready, if you ever feel ready." "And if I'm never ready?" Then I'll have to live with the fact that my actions cost me my relationship with my mother, and I'll have to find a way to be okay with that consequence. The conversation continued for another hour, with Michael answering my questions about his therapy, his support groups, and his current understanding of healthy relationships. He didn't ask me for anything, not forgiveness, not a timeline for reconciliation, not even regular contact. He simply took responsibility for what he'd done and acknowledged that rebuilding trust would be entirely on my timeline and terms. When we parted, I felt emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. Not hopeful that we would necessarily rebuild our relationship, but hopeful that he was genuinely working to become a different person than the one who'd betrayed my trust so thoroughly. Later that evening, I called Linda to tell her about the meeting. She was eager to hear every detail and clearly hoped that this might be the beginning of reconciliation between Michael and me. "So what do you think?" she asked when I finished describing our conversation. "Do you believe he's really changed?" "I think he's changing. Whether he's changed enough, or whether any amount of change would be enough to rebuild trust between us, I honestly don't know. But you're open to the possibility?" "I'm open to seeing what happens over time. If he continues doing the work he says he's doing, if he continues respecting my boundaries, if he shows me through actions rather than words that he's become someone who can have healthy relationships, then maybe someday we can explore having some kind of limited contact." That sounds hopeful. It sounds realistic. Hope and caution aren't mutually exclusive. In the months that followed our coffee meeting, Michael continued his pattern of respectful, limited contact. He sent brief updates about his therapy and support group participation, always making it clear that he wasn't asking for responses or pushing for increased contact. He continued making restitution payments on schedule, and according to Linda, he was consistently demonstrating the kind of behavioral changes he described during our meeting. More importantly for me, I found that thinking about Michael no longer dominated my emotional landscape. He'd become one element of my life rather than the central organizing principle around which everything else revolved. I could consider the possibility of future contact with him without it consuming my thoughts or derailing my sense of peace. My own life continued to expand in directions that had nothing to do with family drama or betrayal recovery. Harold and I had begun discussing moving in together, a prospect that both excited and terrified me in equal measure. Eleanor Chen had become like a sister to me, and our friendship anchored my social world in ways that felt both comfortable and energizing. My work at the legal aid clinic had evolved into something approaching a calling, as I found deep satisfaction in helping other people navigate the aftermath of financial exploitation. I'd become something of a local expert on elder abuse issues and had been asked to speak at several conferences about my own experience and what I'd learned through my recovery process. For years after discovering that intercepted tax return, I barely recognized the woman I'd been before all of this happened. That Eleanor had been focused on managing everyone else's emotions and needs, often at the expense of her own well-being. She'd been afraid of conflict, quick to accept responsibility for other people's poor choices, and more concerned with being loved than with being respected. The Eleanor I'd become was still loving and generous, but in more intentional ways. I was selective about where I invested my emotional energy and with whom I allowed myself to be vulnerable. I'd learned the difference between protecting myself and being selfish, between having boundaries and being mean. Most importantly, I'd learned that my worth wasn't dependent on other people's appreciation or approval. I mattered because I was a human being with inherent dignity, not because of what I could do for other people or how successfully I could meet their needs. 5 years after the beginning of this journey, Michael requested another in-person meeting. His restitution payments had been completed ahead of schedule, and according to Linda, he'd maintained consistent participation in therapy and support groups throughout the intervening time. He'd also begun volunteering with an organization that helped people struggling with financial addiction, suggesting that he was trying to use his own experience to help others avoid similar patterns. This time, I agreed to meet without extensive deliberation. I was curious about his continued progress, confident in my ability to maintain appropriate boundaries, and honestly somewhat eager to see how much more he might have changed. The difference in his demeanor was even more striking than it had been a year earlier. He seemed comfortable in his own skin in a way I'd never seen before, less performative and more genuine. His apology was brief and focused, acknowledging that he'd probably already said everything he could say about his past actions and that what mattered now was demonstrating change through sustained behavior over time. "I don't want to rehash everything again," he said after we'd gotten settled with our coffee. "I assume you're here because you've seen some evidence that I'm continuing to do the work I committed to doing." "That's right. Linda mentions occasionally that you seem to be maintaining the changes you made, and your payments have been consistent." "They have been. And I've learned some things through my volunteer work that I wanted to share with you, not because I'm asking for anything, but because I think they might be helpful for you to hear." "What kinds of things?" "I've been working with other people who financially exploited family members, and I've learned that what I did to you wasn't unusual or uniquely terrible. it's actually a pretty common pattern of behavior. That doesn't excuse what I did, but it might help you understand that your response to it was completely appropriate and that you weren't overreacting or being too harsh. I've learned that through my own volunteer work, I said. But thank you for acknowledging it. I've also learned that most people in your situation never get justice or restitution or even acknowledgement from the family members who exploited them. The fact that you were strong enough to report what I did and follow through with legal consequences probably prevented me from continuing that pattern with other people. Other people? I was already starting to see Linda's family as potential sources of financial support. I was laying the groundwork to manipulate her the same way I'd been manipulating you. If you hadn't stopped me when you did, I probably would have eventually stolen from her too. The confession hit me harder than I'd expected. I'd known intellectually that Michael's behavior had been part of a pattern rather than an isolated incident, but hearing him admit that he'd been preparing to victimize Linda and her family made the scope of his problems, and the importance of my intervention, much clearer. Does Linda know about this? I told her during one of my steps in the program I've been working. She was upset but not entirely surprised. She said she'd noticed that I'd started asking more questions about her finances and making suggestions about how she could optimize her money management. How did she respond? She thanked me for being honest with her. She also said she was proud of you for stopping me before I could hurt her family the way I'd hurt you. We talked for another hour about his recovery process, his volunteer work, and his current understanding of healthy relationships. Toward the end of our conversation, he raised the question I'd been wondering if he would address. Mom, I don't want to push you or put pressure on you, but I do want you to know that if you're ever ready to explore having more regular contact, I'm available for that. Not because I think I deserve it or because I expect it, but because I'd value the opportunity to show you over time that I've become someone who can have a healthy relationship with you. What would that look like? I asked. I don't know. Whatever feels comfortable and safe for you. Maybe occasional phone calls or coffee meetings like this. Maybe family gatherings where we can interact in low-stakes ways. Maybe nothing more than what we're doing right now. I'm genuinely open to following your lead. And if I decide I'm never ready for more contact than we have now, then I'll be grateful for what we do have and try to find peace with that being enough. His answer felt honest and non-manipulative in a way that surprised me. The Michael I remembered would have pushed harder, would have tried to extract some kind of commitment or timeline from me. This version seemed genuinely willing to let me control the terms of our relationship going forward. After leaving our coffee meeting, I found myself thinking more seriously about the possibility of limited reconciliation than I had since the beginning of this whole ordeal. Not full restoration of our previous relationship, that was probably impossible, but perhaps some kind of carefully structured contact that allowed us both to be in each other's lives without recreating the unhealthy dynamics that had caused so much damage. I decided to discuss the possibility with my therapist, a decision that would have seemed absurd to the pre-betrayal Eleanor but felt natural to the woman I'd become. I'd started seeing Dr. Martinez 2 years earlier, initially to help me process the anger and sadness that had followed Michael's betrayal, and later to help me navigate the complex emotions around his attempts at reconciliation. What would you need to see from Michael to feel comfortable with limited contact? Dr. Martinez asked during one of our sessions. I'd need to see sustained change over a longer period of time. 2 years of good behavior isn't necessarily enough to prove that someone has fundamentally changed. I'd also need to feel confident that I could maintain my boundaries even if he started reverting to old patterns. And how would you know if you felt that confident? I think I'd know because my response to him would feel automatic rather than effortful. Right now, I have to consciously monitor my reactions to him and remind myself not to fall back into old patterns of enabling and rescuing. If he'd really changed and if I'd really internalized my new boundaries, interacting with him would feel more natural and less vigilant. That sounds like a reasonable standard. How long do you think you'd need to observe sustained change before you felt ready to trust it? Maybe another year or two. Maybe longer. I don't want to put a timeline on it because that would create pressure to make a decision before I'm really ready. Dr. Martinez helped me develop a framework for evaluating my comfort level with increased contact over time. We talked about red flags that might indicate Michael was reverting to old behaviors, warning signs that I might be slipping back into unhealthy patterns, and strategies for maintaining my emotional equilibrium regardless of what happened with our relationship. 6 months later, I felt ready to try a small experiment. Linda was hosting a birthday party for one of her children, and rather than asking Michael not to attend or staying away myself, I decided to see how it felt to be in the same space as him in a family context. I told Linda about my decision and asked her to help me maintain appropriate boundaries if I seemed to be struggling. The party was held in Linda's backyard on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Michael arrived after I did, greeted me politely but not effusively, and generally behaved like a respectful acquaintance rather than trying to recreate our old dynamic. He spent most of his time interacting with his nieces and nephews, and I found myself observing his behavior with them for signs of the manipulation and entitlement that had characterized his relationship with me. What I saw was someone who seemed genuinely invested in the children's enjoyment of their party, who played games with them and listened to their stories without appearing to be performing for the adults' benefit. He offered to help with cleanup without being asked and didn't seem to be keeping score of his contributions or expecting special recognition for them. Most importantly, he seemed comfortable with the fact that he and I were interacting minimally. He didn't try to corner me for private conversations, didn't make pointed references to our shared history, and didn't seem to be using the family gathering as an opportunity to push for increased contact between us. By the end of the afternoon, I felt cautiously optimistic that he might actually have learned how to interact with family members without hidden agendas or ulterior motives. I wasn't ready to trust him completely, but I was ready to consider allowing him to be present at family gatherings without feeling like I had to protect myself from his behavior. Over the next year, we repeated this pattern several times, family gatherings where we interacted politely but limitedly, with Michael consistently demonstrating respect for my boundaries and apparent genuine change in his approach to family relationships. Linda reported that his behavior with her family had also remained consistently appropriate, with no signs of financial manipulation or inappropriate requests for support. 7 years after the discovery that changed my life, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible during the early stages of this journey. I invited Michael to have dinner with me at my apartment. Not because I'd forgiven and forgotten everything that had happened between us, but because I'd reached a point where I felt confident in my ability to maintain healthy boundaries regardless of his behavior. He accepted the invitation gracefully and arrived exactly on time with flowers from the grocery store and a bottle of wine. Nothing fancy or expensive, just the kind of small gesture that acknowledged the significance of the occasion without trying to buy his way back into my good graces. We cooked dinner together, falling into an easy rhythm in the kitchen that reminded me of pleasant times from years past without making me nostalgic for a relationship that hadn't been as healthy as I'd believed it was. Our conversation was comfortable but not intimate, touching on his work situation, my volunteer activities, and shared memories that we could both enjoy without reopening old wounds. After dinner, as we sat at my kitchen table with our wine, Michael brought up the subject I'd wondered if he would address. "Mom, I want you to know how grateful I am that you were willing to have me over tonight. I know it's not something you did lightly, and I don't take it for granted. What does it mean to you?" I asked. "It means you've seen enough sustained change in my behavior to trust me in your personal space again. It means you believe I've become someone who can respect your boundaries and interact with you honestly. It doesn't mean you've forgotten what I did or that our relationship is back to what it used to be, but it means you're willing to explore what our relationship could become going forward." His understanding of the situation was accurate and demonstrated the kind of emotional intelligence that had been completely absent from his interactions with me during the years when he'd been stealing from me. "And what do you hope our relationship becomes going forward?" "I hope we can have the kind of relationship where we see each other occasionally, where we can enjoy each other's company without either of us feeling anxious or guarded, where I can be someone who adds value to your life rather than someone who takes from it. I don't need to be the most important person in your life or to have the kind of access to you that I used to have. I just want to be someone you're genuinely glad to see when we do spend time together." "That sounds achievable," I said, and was surprised to realize I meant it. The dinner marked the beginning of a new phase in our relationship, limited but genuine contact that felt sustainable for both of us. We began having dinner together once a month or so, sometimes at my apartment and sometimes at restaurants. We attended family gatherings without drama or tension. We had phone conversations that lasted 20 minutes rather than 2 hours and focused on current events rather than rehashing old grievances. Most importantly, I stopped feeling like I needed to protect myself from him. Our interactions became a source of mild pleasure rather than stress, evidence that it was possible for relationships to be rebuilt after serious damage, albeit in very different form than they'd taken originally. The process had taken 8 years from beginning to end, 8 years of pain, growth, boundary setting, and careful evaluation of whether trust could ever be rebuilt. During that time, I discovered strengths I didn't know I had, developed relationships that enriched my life in unexpected ways, and learned that protecting myself wasn't selfish but necessary. Michael had lost the privileged access to me that he'd once taken for granted, but he'd gained something more valuable, a mother who respected herself enough to demand respectful treatment, and a relationship based on mutual consideration rather than one-sided exploitation. I'd lost the son I thought I had, but I'd gained the insight that the relationship I'd been trying so hard to preserve hadn't actually been worth preserving. In its place, I'd built a life that felt authentic and sustainable, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide for them. Now, as I sit by my window watching another Brooklyn sunset, I think about the woman who first discovered that intercepted tax return almost a decade ago. She was so afraid of being alone that she'd accepted being used rather than risk losing the people who claimed to love her. She measured her worth by other people's approval and couldn't imagine prioritizing her own well-being over other people's comfort. That woman lives on in my memory, but she no longer lives in my mirror. The woman I see there now has learned that being alone is not the same thing as being abandoned, that demanding respect is not the same thing as being selfish, and that love without boundaries is not actually love at all. My relationship with Michael will never be what it was before his betrayal, and I'm grateful for that fact. What we had before wasn't healthy for either of us, it was based on my fear of his disapproval and his sense of entitlement to my resources. What we have now is smaller but more honest, limited but more respectful. Some relationships can be repaired after serious damage. Others need to end completely. And some, like mine with Michael, need to be rebuilt from the ground up in entirely different form. None of these outcomes is automatically right or wrong, they're all valid responses to betrayal, depending on the specific circumstances and the people involved. What matters is that you choose the response that honors your own dignity and protects your own well-being, regardless of what other people think you should do. What matters is that you remember your worth doesn't depend on other people's appreciation of you, and your value doesn't decrease when people fail to recognize it. What matters is that you understand the difference between loving someone and allowing them to damage you in the name of that love. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their harmful behavior, even if that refusal causes both of you pain in the short term. If any part of my story has felt familiar to you, I want you to know that you deserve better than relationships that diminish your sense of worth or security. You deserve to be treated with respect by the people who claim to love you. You deserve to feel safe in your own life, financially and emotionally. You are not responsible for managing other people's emotions or fixing other people's problems, especially when doing so comes at the cost of your own well-being. You are not obligated to accept poor treatment because the person mistreating you is family or because they claim their behavior is motivated by love or need. You have the right to protect yourself, to demand honesty, and to choose relationships that add value to your life rather than drain it. You have the right to say no, to set boundaries, and to prioritize your own needs without feeling guilty about it. Most importantly, you are stronger than you think you are, and you can survive losing people who don't treat you well. The life you build after cutting ties with those who exploit you may be smaller in some ways, but it will be more authentic and more peaceful than the one you leave behind. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family, used by people who claim to love you, or afraid to stand up for yourself because you feared being abandoned? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted had been betraying that trust systematically while you made excuses for them? Share your story in the comments below. Let's create a community of people who understand that self-respect isn't selfish and that demanding honesty isn't mean. If this story helped you feel less alone in your own struggles, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these difficult but necessary truths with people who need to hear them. Remember, you deserve relationships that honor your worth, and you're strong enough to create them, even if it means letting go of relationships that don't serve you. Your peace of mind and sense of security are worth protecting, even from people who share your last name. Thank you for listening to my story, and for having the courage to examine your own.